There were no screams, no signs of a struggle, and no farewell note left behind. Only an old wooden cabin stood in silence in the forests of Idaho, its front door locked, its windows shut tight, the interior so neat it sent a chill down the spine. 4 beds were neatly made. The dishes had been washed and left to dry on the rack. A wool sweater belonging to the mother still hung on its hook, as if she had only stepped outside for a moment. But that family never came back. They were the Calloway family, a father with a steady job, a mother who taught elementary school, and 2 children far too young to understand what it meant to disappear. There were no debts, no conflicts, no dark past. They had simply gone away for the weekend. That morning, the mother smiled and waved to a neighbor, saying they would be home Sunday evening. The father started the familiar pickup truck. The children sat in the back with their toys and laughter. No one in town imagined it would be the last time they ever saw the Calloways. When Monday came and the mother did not show up at her classroom, the children waited in uneasy silence. When the father failed to report for his shift at the hydroelectric plant, concern crept into every unanswered question. And then the police opened the door of the cabin deep in the woods. There were no bodies, no blood, no vehicle, only a thick, suffocating silence, as if the forest itself had closed around them. What could cause an ordinary family to vanish completely without leaving a single trace? Had they chosen to leave on their own, or had someone stepped out of the shadows? And if so, why? 10 years later, did the forest remain the only keeper of the answer? This story does not begin with death. It begins with silence. The Calloway family was the kind people easily passed over in memory, simply because they were so ordinary. Ordinary enough that no one believed tragedy could ever find them. Harold Calloway, 38, was a mechanical engineer at the Clearwater Hydroelectric Plant, a man who lived by principles and routine. Every morning, he woke at the same hour, brewed his coffee in the same chipped ceramic mug, polished his shoes before leaving the house, and always hung his keys in the exact same spot by the door. His coworkers said you could tell time by Harold's habits. In 10 years, he had never once arrived late. To Harold, stability was the only way to keep life from slipping beyond control. Margaret Calloway, 34, his wife, taught second grade at Elkford Elementary School. She had the gentle demeanor of someone who listened more than she spoke, handwriting always neat, her voice carefully measured so as not to wound anyone. Even when the children were loud or unruly, Margaret believed patience could outlast any chaos. At home, she was the one who remembered every student's birthday, folded laundry into perfectly stacked piles, and kept a warm dinner ready no matter how late her husband came home. Samuel, their eldest, was 10, quiet, withdrawn, content to sit for hours by the window with a pencil and sketchpad. He drew houses, forests, long roads with no people on them. Lucy, 6 years old, was his opposite in every way. Always smiling, always asking questions, always running through the house clutching her stuffed bear named Patch, as if the world had no power to make her sad. They lived in a white, 2-story house on the edge of town, close enough to hear the distant rumble of passing trains, close enough to the forest that every breeze carried the scent of pine and damp leaves. Each evening, the porch lights switched on at the same hour. The 4 of them gathered around the dinner table, sharing small stories, ordinary moments, the kind people believe will repeat forever. No one in Elkford thought the family harbored secrets, and no one imagined that this peaceful life was only a fragile shell, stretched thin over a darkness quietly drawing closer. On Friday morning, October 15th, 1982, Elkford woke slowly, just as it always did. Mist still clung to rooftops, and the damp scent of pine drifted through the narrow streets. The Calloway family began that morning no differently than on any of their previous trips. Harold secured the small trailer to the back of the blue pickup truck that had served him for years, checking every rope, every latch, with the familiar precision he brought to everything in life. Margaret carried out the bag she had packed neatly the night before: food for the weekend, warm clothes for the children, a few books, and Samuel's box of colored pencils. Lucy ran circles around the yard, clutching her stuffed bear Patch, laughing as she went, unaware that this would be the last morning of her carefree childhood. Before getting into the truck, Margaret paused to say goodbye to Mrs. Fletcher, the neighbor next door. Her voice was gentle as always as she explained they were heading to the old cabin by Pinehurst Lake for the weekend, and would be back Sunday evening. Mrs. Fletcher would later remember that smile clearly, unhurried, unworried, the smile of someone certain everything would unfold exactly as planned. The truck rolled out of Elkford around 9:30 in the morning, moving slowly past familiar roads, the gas station, the bend where the forest thickened and the radio signal began to fade. The cabin by Pinehurst Lake was not unfamiliar to them. It had belonged to Harold's family for nearly 30 years, a place where he had grown up, learned to swim along the lake's edge, and listened to his father's stories by the fireplace every autumn. For Margaret, it was a rare place of quiet, where the sound of water lapping against the shore replaced alarm clocks and town noise. For the children, it was another world altogether. Sparkling water, an old wooden dock for fishing, and forests large enough to hold endless imagined wonders. When the truck stopped in front of the cabin, the lake reflected the autumn sunlight like a sheet of silver. Everything felt so familiar that none of them felt the need to worry. They opened the door, carried their bags inside, lit the stove, and prepared for what they believed would be an ordinary weekend, trusting that the place which had always been the family's refuge would protect them once again. No one knew that it was precisely this familiarity that kept them from noticing. Some journeys begin in perfect calm, but have no path that leads back. As the sun slipped behind the mountain ridge, the cabin by Pinehurst Lake sank into a silence unique to deep forest, an absence of sound that was never entirely peaceful, one that demanded attention. Firelight flickered against the old wooden walls, warming the room, while outside the darkness arrived quickly and thickened with each passing minute. Wind moved through the tall pines, producing long, low sounds like breathing, sometimes close, sometimes distant, causing Margaret to tighten her coat around her shoulders as she prepared dinner. The children went to sleep early, exhausted from the long drive. Samuel slept with his sketchbook clutched against his chest. Lucy turned toward Patch, her breathing slow and even. Harold sat alone at the table, staring out the window where the lake had become a flat, black surface, reflecting no stars. He listened, not out of fear, but out of habit. He was a man who believed everything had order, even the sounds of night. But as the hours passed, the forest no longer held that familiar rhythm. There were faint noises from the front porch, soft, deliberate, like footsteps touching the wood, stopping, then disappearing. Harold stood, opened the door, and found only cold mist and a dense wall of darkness between the trees. No one was there. When he returned inside, Margaret was awake. She asked quietly if something was wrong. Harold shook his head and said it was probably just the wind, but his voice no longer carried its usual certainty. The night stretched on, each minute lengthened by the ticking of the wall clock. Just when everything seemed to settle, another sound emerged, farther away, more rhythmic, as if someone were circling the cabin, moving slowly and carefully. Margaret lay still, afraid to wake the children, unable to close her eyes under the weight of being watched. It was not panic, but a dull, persistent unease, the kind that tells you something is wrong without giving it a name. Harold paced the narrow room, touching the doorframe, the wooden walls of his childhood, trying to convince himself that this place was still safe. Outside, the forest whispered in its ancient language of leaves and wind. Inside, a family lay in darkness, listening to every sound, unaware that this first night had marked the beginning of the final hours they would ever spend together. In the days that followed, unease never left the Calloway family. It crept into every small habit, turning the familiar into something heavy and strained. Harold stopped sleeping. Night after night, while Margaret and the children drifted into restless sleep, he stayed awake, walking the narrow hallway of the cabin, listening for every sound rising from the forest. It was no longer a single uneasy night, but many in succession. Nights when he sat with his back against the wall, eyes open in the dark, as if closing them would allow something outside to move one step closer. Margaret noticed the change quickly. Harold grew quieter, more withdrawn, his gaze drawn toward the door whenever the wind stirred. A few days before the trip, he had silently replaced the latch on the back door of their house in Elkford, a heavy, sturdy bolt installed from the inside. He offered no explanation, only said it made him feel safer. Margaret did not press him, but the seed of worry had already taken root. In rare moments alone, she opened the small notebook she used for scattered thoughts and reminders. Her handwriting remained neat, but the sentences grew shorter, more cautious. She wrote that Harold had been pacing again the night before, that she was afraid to wake the children, that the sound of the lake felt closer than usual. These were not the writings of someone in panic, but the quiet anxiety of a mother trying to keep her family intact. A few days later, Harold called the Clearwater County Sheriff's Office. He reported unfamiliar footprints around the Pinehurst cabin, said he had found a metal cup left on the porch that did not belong to the family. His voice remained calm, precise, not a plea for help, but a report meant to be recorded. When deputies arrived the following morning, everything was gone. No footprints. The porch was empty. A report was filed and set aside as a minor misunderstanding. But for the Callaways, the signs did not disappear. They accumulated silently. Each sleepless night, each carefully locked door, each brief line in Margaret's notebook. Small warnings no one stopped to hear. And in that silence, they continued living, continued believing things would eventually be fine, unaware that sometimes the most frightening things are not what we see, but what we choose to ignore. The disappearance of the Calloway family did not arrive with noise or chaos. It came softly and coldly, like breath being drawn from a room. When Monday passed and Margaret failed to appear at school, her colleagues assumed she was ill or delayed. When Harold missed his morning shift at the hydroelectric plant, something that had never happened in 10 years, concern truly began. By the following day, with unanswered phone calls and the house in Elkford still closed and silent, Clearwater County deputies headed toward the cabin at Pinehurst Lake. The winding forest road felt longer than usual. Radio signals weakened, then vanished, leaving only the sound of the engine echoing through dense trees. The cabin door was locked when they arrived. Inside, the air smelled of old pine smoke and cold coffee. Everything was unnervingly neat. Beds were made. Dishes had been washed and left to dry. Clothes hung in their proper places, as if the family had stepped out briefly. But they were not there. The blue pickup truck was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no disturbance, not a single drop of blood. The cabin looked like an unfinished photograph, time frozen just before something happened. Search efforts began immediately. Helicopters swept over narrow mountain roads. Divers searched the cold lake. Rangers on horseback followed every trail through the forest. Names were called, day after day, but only the forest answered. No footprints led away from the cabin. No trace of the vehicle was found. One deputy, entering the cabin for the first time, heard a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the fireplace, water dripping onto cold ash. When he knelt to inspect it, there was no leak. The roof was intact. The fireplace was dry. The sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped, as if it had never existed. The detail was recorded in the report, then buried beneath stacks of paperwork. By the end of the month, the search was scaled back. The Callaways were officially listed as missing with no signs of violence. But for those who stood in the cabin that day, the sterile odor and the invisible dripping sound remained, a wordless question of how a family could vanish without leaving a trace, and whether they had left on their own or been led away in silence. Time began doing what it does best, settling a thin layer of dust over whatever hope remained. In the days after the Callaways vanished, relatives and neighbors waited, believing a call would come, some small sign that they were still alive. Weeks passed, then months. Missing person posters covered Elkford and nearby towns. Harold's face, Margaret's, the children's. They stared out from fragile paper, as fragile as the belief of those who hung them. Rain blurred the ink. Wind tore the corners. One poster fell outside the grocery store, was stepped on, then carried away with dry leaves. No one meant to forget them, but life continued, and memory grew tired. The media reported on the case briefly, then moved on to newer, closer tragedies. The file was closed and placed deep in storage, where unanswered questions wait until no one asks them anymore. In Elkford, the white two-story house still stood, empty. No children's voices, no smell of dinner, only a strange silence. Yet every evening at 7 o'clock, the porch light turned on. A simple timer Harold had installed so Margaret wouldn't come home to darkness. Night after night, the yellow lights spilled onto empty steps, a stubborn vigil that refused to end. Neighbors noticed. Some felt sorrow. Others quietly looked away. To them, the light was a reminder that a family once lived there, once laughed, once planned ordinary days. But no one returned. The first year passed, then the second, then the third. The search was officially suspended. The case labeled cold, a sterile word for a pain that never cooled. Time brought no answers, only a prolonged silence, leaving behind a house, a porch light, and the memory of a family that vanished as if it had never existed. Except for the empty spaces nothing could ever fill. 10 years after the Calloway family disappeared, their case had become little more than a fading name in an old file, until a summer morning in 1992, when Donna Ray stepped into the Clearwater County Evidence Warehouse. She was 27, on light duty after a knee injury, assigned to reorganize boxes no one cared to open anymore. The warehouse was gray and airless, smelling of old paper and rusted metal. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, as if exhausted from illuminating stories the world had already forgotten. Donna worked in silence all morning until she noticed an old cardboard box shoved into a corner behind a broken filing cabinet. The tape had gone brittle, the edges softened by damp. On the lid, 4 words had been written in black marker, now faded. Calloway Cabin, October 82. She stood still for a long moment. The name stirred a faint childhood memory, one of those stories everyone in Idaho had heard, even if only in whispers. Inside were 3 evidence bags, a few children's toys, a notebook scorched at the edges, and a disposable camera, the cheap kind once sold at gas stations. There was no transfer form, no signature, as if the box had never officially existed. Donna picked up the camera. The plastic had hardened with age. On the back, a small strip of tape still clung, bearing a scribbled note. Last roll at the cabin. In that instant, she understood she was standing at a boundary. She could return it to the shelf and keep doing her job, or she could take one step further into a story that had never truly ended. That afternoon, she drove to the only photo lab still operating in town and handed the old camera to the gray-haired man behind the counter. 3 days later, she returned and received a thin yellow envelope, 12 developed photographs. The first images were ordinary family moments. Harold smiling beside a grill, Margaret brushing Lucy's hair, Samuel holding up a small fish on the dock. Then the light began to dim. The framing tilted, as if the photographer's hands were shaking, until the final photograph. A dark room, a burst of flash splitting the space. Harold Calloway stood alone, his face blank, his eyes open but not looking into the lens, as though listening to something beyond sight. A tiny printed timestamp beneath the photo made Donna's blood turn cold. 3:11 a.m. After 10 years of silence, time had spoken for the first time. And in that moment, in an empty parking lot, Donna holding the envelope with trembling hands, the Calloway case woke from its long sleep, carrying the sense that some truths do not disappear. They only wait to be seen again. When the Calloway case was reopened, the return to the cabin at Pinehurst Lake no longer felt like a search for hope. It felt like stepping into a memory abandoned for too long. The forest road was narrower than before, choked on both sides by thick growth. Dry branches scraped the vehicle like grasping hands. The cabin appeared in an overgrown clearing, its roof sagging, its windows clouded by dust and rain, smaller than it had looked in photographs 10 years earlier. Inside, the air was cold and damp, the smell of rotting wood mixed with soil left undisturbed for years. Flashlight beams swept across the room where the family had once gathered. Now there were only tilted chairs, warped boards, and old ash in the fireplace. When someone knelt near the hearth, they noticed a floorboard that did not quite align with the others. A light touch produced a hollow, heavy sound. The board was lifted. Beneath it was a crude trap door leading into a narrow space below, something built to hide what no one wanted to see. Down there, in the corner of the dark, sat an old cardboard box. On the outside, written in faded black marker, Lucy's things. When the lid was opened, no one spoke. Inside lay a porcelain doll with one eye chipped, a worn child's mitten, several colored pencils melted and stuck together, all wrapped in a faded pink blanket. Among them was a small sketchbook. Page by page, the drawings appeared in childish lines. A family of 4 standing in front of the cabin under a yellow sun. Then the sun vanished. The sky turned gray. The trees darkened. In later pages, The father's figure was shaded heavily in red, strokes hard and frantic, pressing so forcefully the paper tore. The final page made the cabin seem to hold its breath. The father's shape had been crossed out again and again, drowned in red, like a desperate attempt to erase something too large for a 6-year-old to carry. When flashlights scanned the space beneath the floor, a shoe print appeared in the dry dirt, far larger than any child's, pressed deep, as if someone had knelt there for a long time. That print did not belong to any peaceful memory. It was a silent proof that the cabin had never held only 4 people. In that decaying space, between children's toys and red-smeared drawings, the truth began to take shape not through words, but through a tightening in the chest. That fear had been very close to the Calloway family, long before they vanished. A week after returning to the cabin, with images of the trapdoor and Lucy's red drawings still clinging to their minds, investigators visited Earl Haskins, a retired ranger who had patrolled the Pinehurst woods in the early 80s. Earl lived alone in a small log house. His back was bent, his hands rough from decades in the forest, his voice hoarse and slow, as if each sentence had to push through a heavy layer of memory. When he heard the name Calloway, he fell silent for a long time, staring out the window at pines standing still in the wind. Then he said there was something he had carried for years, something he had never told anyone. In the summer of 1983, nearly a year after the Callaways disappeared, Earl found a disposable camera half buried in mud less than a kilometer from the Pinehurst cabin. At the time, he assumed it belonged to a hunter, a camper, some stranger passing through, and because the case had already cooled, he never turned it in. He kept it in an old tin box, untouched for nearly 10 years, until insomnia began to eat at him and old questions returned each night. When the film was developed, the photos emerged like the measured breaths of a long night. The first frames were strangely calm, pine trees veiled in mist, the lake flat and silent, the empty dock, a pale pink sky at dusk. Then the light changed. One photograph showed the cabin door slightly open, warm yellow light spilling out. The image tilted as if the photographer was moving too quickly. The next frame captured the front steps. In the corner, under flash, the toe of a large boot appeared, mud-streaked, pointing directly toward the door. By the last photo, the air seemed to tighten. It was taken from inside the cabin through a window. The flash reflected off the glass, but behind that harsh bloom of light stood a figure in the trees, tall, motionless, as if it had been there for a very long time. The faint timestamp beneath the image made the room go silent. 4:02 a.m. When specialists measured the boot in the photograph, the estimate was clear, men's size 11. Harold Calloway's record listed him as size 9. The difference was small on paper, but in a quiet office, it felt as heavy as an accusation that didn't need words. It meant that on the night the Calloway family vanished, at least 2 men had been awake at the same time, one inside the cabin and one standing just beyond the edge of light, watching in. 2 cameras, 2 angles, 2 different breaths moving through the same stretch of time. And from that moment on, the story was no longer about a family who somehow vanished in the woods. It was about the quiet presence of a second man, someone who had been close for a long time, even while no one dared to name him. The name Raymond Calloway appeared late in the file, like a missing piece concealed for years. But once it slid into place, scattered details began to align with unsettling ease. Raymond was Harold's older brother, 6 years ahead of him. He had once been the family's pride, enlisting young and earning praise as a technical soldier known for discipline and endurance. But war and sleepless nights left marks no one could see. His military record stated, in clipped language, that he was discharged in the late 70s due to severe insomnia accompanied by nighttime hallucinations, a cold phrase for a mind slowly detaching from reality. After returning home, Raymond slipped out of the family's life. No permanent address, no stable work. For years, no one spoke his name, as if silence was the only way the family could keep living. In old photographs found at Harold's house, Raymond always stood slightly behind the others, his eyes not meeting the lens. like someone accustomed to the margins. Investigators discovered that in the months before the Callaways disappeared, ranger reports had documented a wandering man near the Pinerist Woods, living in makeshift shelters, stealing food from vacant cabins, always gone before dawn. The physical description matched Raymond in a way that felt too precise to ignore. Other fragments surfaced as well. A shop owner in a nearby town recalled a man who looked remarkably like Harold buying canned coffee and rope and saying not a single word throughout the transaction. When the brothers were placed side by side in the file, small differences became crucial. Harold had chosen stability, family, routine, a life measured and regular. Raymond had never found a place to stand after the war, and the circle closed at the Pinerist cabin, where both had grown up, where childhood memory still lived in every plank of wood. Even Margaret's scorched notebook took on new meaning. She had not written that a stranger walked around the house. She wrote that he had been pacing again at night. That wording did not carry the terror of an unknown intruder, but the helpless recognition of something familiar that had stopped being safe. Raymond did not emerge from the forest like a faceless ghost. He returned from the family's own past, carrying sleepless nights, sounds only he could hear, and the sense that only this place could hold him still. In this story, tragedy did not begin with hatred. It began with blood, with an older brother who could not find a way back to ordinary life, and a younger brother who believed silence could protect everyone, until silence became the most dangerous thing of all.
The final truth did not arrive as a violent shock. It came like a heavy door slowly forced open after years of silence. In the spring of 1993, during a terrain survey near Pinerist Lake, workers noticed a piece of blue metal exposed beneath dirt and tangled roots. When the soil was cleared, a Ford F-150 emerged, not intact, but nose down on a slope, warped by time and frost. Inside the truck were three bodies. Margaret sat in the passenger seat. The two children were in the back, still belted in, as if the trip had never ended. There were no signs of a high-impact crash, no injuries consistent with a sudden plunge. The truck had not launched off the road. It had slid, slowly, deliberately. The driver's seat had been pulled back farther than usual so Harold could reach the pedals. On the steering wheel, technicians recovered another set of fingerprints, preserved beneath dried tree resin. They matched Raymond Calloway. Harold was not in the truck. He had vanished earlier. The discovery opened an answer no one wanted. The Callaways had not left on their own. They had been taken into the night by someone not unfamiliar. A year later, unidentified remains were found deep in the Pinerist forest, not far from where the truck had been recovered. When forensic methods were updated with newer technology, the name surfaced. Raymond Calloway. The circle closed. In the pocket of his old jacket were a set of Ford keys and a faded photograph. In the picture, Harold sat inside the cabin, eyes closed, hands resting on his knees, calm in a way that hurt to look at. No date, no caption, only the familiar silence. The file concluded that Raymond had caused the chain of events that led to the deaths of his brother's family, then disappeared into the forest himself. But one question was never fully answered. What happened to Harold in those final hours? How hard did he try to protect his family? And in the moment he faced the brother carrying the darkness of the past, did he choose silence or sacrifice? The truth could be written on paper, but pain cannot be filed away. It remained in that forest, alongside a truck buried in earth, a father never recovered, and a family lost in a silence no one reached in time. 2 years after the truth was officially closed on paper, a summer storm swept through the Pinerist woods. Lightning struck the old cabin roof. The fire spread so quickly, no one could stop it. By the time firefighters arrived, the structure had collapsed completely, leaving only stone foundation and smoldering ash. No one tried to rebuild. Some places do not need to be built again. The following spring, the trail was reopened, And by the lake, the county placed a small bronze plaque with a simple inscription in memory of the Calloway family. It did not name the crime. It did not retell the tragedy. It only recorded that they had once lived, once loved, and once belonged to this place. Travelers rarely stopped for long. Some left wildflowers. Some stood still for a moment, then moved on, carrying a heaviness they could not quite name. For those who knew the story, that forest was no longer only trees and water. It was a vault for memory, a place where silence became the final witness. Harold Calloway was never found. He remains somewhere between what was lost, inside a photograph taken at 3:11 a.m., eyes not afraid, only recognizing. Some tragedies do not end with gunshots or confessions, but with the slow erasure of a family. And an older brother who never found his way home. And if this story makes you pause, if you feel that silence still echoing somewhere, share what you're thinking. Stories like this do not need to be spoken loudly. They only need to be heard. So what was forgotten does not disappear again.